It is, isn't it?
There we are. Time.
Order. Well, welcome again, Prime Minister, to what is the 11th, but also the final question session. Sorry? The final session of questions with the Liaison Committee. Today we have 3 themes. You were notified as normal as of themes, but as before, you've been given no indication of the questions. The themes today are, first, the business of governing; secondly, the consequences of constitutional change; and thirdly, interventionism and foreign policy. As this is a shorter session, I intend to go straight into the first theme, the business of governing, and John Denham.
Delivery, or at least can we ask about how your experience of trying to make public services better actually shaped your policies? You began saying wise spending, not big spending. You began with a very top-down approach to public service reform. Today, you've more or less doubled real spending in most of the major services, but an approach to public sector reform which even some of your advisors say are quite similar to things you'd opposed in the past. Can you pick out what the major events were that caused you to change the approach that you took to public service reform over the past 10 years?
First of all, on the level of public spending, I think we were always determined to increase that significantly, since I think one of the big problems that we inherited was an underinvestment in the public realm. So I think that was always going to happen. Secondly, the big change that came about, or evolution in thinking, if you like, was to move from a situation where the reform was very much driven from the top down. And I mean, I don't ignore the importance of that, incidentally. I don't think we would have got the big improvements on literacy and numeracy in primary schools, or the initial gains on waiting lists coming down without that top-down approach. And I still think that it has its own validity in certain specific areas. For example, accident and emergency departments I don't think would have been changed, but for a very specific centrally driven target. On the other hand, I think as our experience of changing structure developed, then I became a far stronger advocate of breaking down the monolithic structures, opening things up to competition and contestability and so on, but doing it still very much on a basis of keeping the values of the public service intact.
When you look at the opposition you had to those changes, you once talked famously about the forces of conservatism. I don't think you named them at the time, but I just wonder now, when there's less people to offend, whether you'd like to say who the forces of conservatism were.
Well, it was taken at the time, that speech, as an attack on the Conservative Party, which actually it wasn't. It was, in fact... why not, exactly? Which is also what the Labour Party thought. But it was really to do with small c conservatism, and it wasn't part born out of my experience in government that was already pushing me towards more radical structural reform of public services, and also the view, which is the view I hold more strongly now than ever before after 10 years of government, which is that just as companies and organisations are subject to continual change, almost a permanent revolution in change in order to keep up to date with the way the world's changing, so public services have got to do the same. And in the end, part of the trouble with top-down approaches is not merely that if that top-down approach slackens for any reason, the pressure comes off. It's also that the centre is too slow to keep up with the pace of change that is happening, and therefore I mean, I, particularly in relation to the health service, have moved very much to the view, which is why we've introduced these reforms in the past few years, that you need what I would call self-sustaining and self-generating change. And I think that is, you know, if you look at where the really big falls in health service waiting lists have come, and that was the problem we inherited in 1997, they came when we started to introduce patient choice.
So where were the forces of conservatism? Were they primarily within Whitehall and the civil service structures, or were they the people out there that you wanted to deliver change?
I think, I mean, again, my experience of change is that whilst you're introducing it, everyone says it's a terrible idea. I mean, provided, you know, the changes obviously are in the right direction. Once they're introduced, it's a lot easier. If you take tuition fees, for example, when we first introduced those, I mean, people described it as my equivalent to the poll tax. It was going to be a complete disaster. University applications would slump. It would lead to huge rises in inequality. Now, I think there's a virtual consensus that the system should change. Sorry, our Liberal Democrat colleagues.
Thank you for acknowledging that.
Maybe a little slow to catch up with that consensus, but nonetheless, I think you would have to argue, obviously, that it's in a completely different position politically today than it was then. And I think that really what happens, and I think this is true in the public services, it's true in every walk of life. I think if you talk to any corporate person who's taken through a big change program, they'll tell you when they first announced it, everyone said, well, I think this is going to be terrible, and so on. Some of the changes first introduced in the Labour Party were treated in the same way. So, you know, I think that in the end, the most difficult thing is just keeping people aware of the fact that nowadays in the public services, if you want the high expectations of the public met, you've got to be prepared to change the whole time.
Can I be clear? Do you now think that you've changed the culture in the public services so that change, whatever the next round of change is, will be more widely accepted? Or is this simply an inevitable part of the business of governing, that whenever you try to change something, you're going to have that small c conservatism trying to hold you back?
I think, truthfully, yes. I think you will always have that trying to hold you back. But I think that also, for example, in the health service now, there are major structural changes that you don't need to keep going back over, but I think they will carry their own momentum of change forward. For example, you know, tomorrow we're indicating to people how they can use the internet technology in order to make choices about their healthcare. If you think of this you know, let's say 2-3 years down the line, where people can choose to have their operation in a range of different hospitals in the country, where independent providers can come in and provide the services if it's not being provided well enough elsewhere, there will be, of necessity, a lot of change that will come as a result of that. And so I think it's also getting people used to the idea, which is very common in the private sector, that nowadays you would expect continually, in a sense, to update and to adjust as the world around you changes.
Several of the candidates for deputy leader of the Labour Party have talked about trying to overcome some of the alienation and hostility of public sector workers to the changes that have taken place. Looking back over 10 years, do you think you could have done more to take people with you on the changes?
Yes, I think we could have, and I think it's important, and I'm not saying that we got this right over the last 10 years. It's important constantly to explain to people why it is you're trying to make the change. But I also think that, you know, you also need to be able to create, though, a culture in the public service which does not immediately resist change or end up in a situation which I think there is a risk happening here. And let me, you know, try and choose my words carefully. But I think there is a danger sometimes that the public service unions and associations almost get into a competition with each other as to who can, you know, flag up the most resistance to change. And I think that can sometimes be unhelpful because it ends, you know, what was interesting to me is when we held, on the 30th of April this year, with the help of the King's Fund, we held this seminar and meeting on the National Health Service, and we had everyone there, including Unison, the BMA, and so on. So the RCN, all the people that we might have expected to be very, very critical, they were still critical, but all of them said, that the National Health Service had improved immeasurably over the past 10 years. Now, I mean, my point to them is that occasionally it's a good idea to state that and then go on to your criticism, rather than simply making your criticism, which leads the public to believe the health service is getting worse, when actually it's absolutely obvious on any independent basis it's getting better. So I think, that too can be a problem in taking people with you. In other words, if you get into a bidding war between the various organisations as to who's going to stick it on the government most, sometimes that is actually self-defeating in terms of the morale of the organisation. Because I find with public service workers, what they most want, in a sense, is recognition of their commitment and their dedication, their professionalism. And to be self-critical for a minute, I don't think we have, and I have, said sufficiently to our public servants, you are doing a great job of public service, and even though I believe these reforms are necessary, that is in no way a diminution of my respect for your commitment or your professionalism. Now, sometimes we say it and it doesn't get heard, but I think perhaps we need to do more there.
Thank you. Dr. Wood.
Prime Minister, I won't go into top-up fees, but in 2004, Lord Butler famously described your style of government as sofa government. Saying, and I quote, "The informality and circumscribed nature of the government's procedures risk reducing the scope for informed collective political judgment." At what point, Prime Minister, did you decide to abandon cabinet government and rely on sofa government with the approach of hand-picked friends and special advisors?
That's not a loaded question anyway, is
No.
I think, in fairness to what Robin Butler has said, and I think I've said this before, and he was there for, I think, about 8 months of the government as we came in, and incidentally did a very good job of helping the transition, which is a big thing to do after 18 years of one party being in government. And I've already said that I think in the first period of time, probably, for a time you were still functioning almost mentally and psychologically as an opposition party rather than a governing party. But I have to say, over the past years, I mean, it just wouldn't be correct to say there isn't a proper functioning cabinet government. I mean, there's 50 different cabinet committees. I mean, I chair, I think, 16 of them. There's all of the major public service reforms we've done in the last few years have been not just through cabinet committees, but through cabinet itself with detailed discussion on it. And I just don't recognise the description. I think the other thing that's really important to say, however, is I don't believe, having done this job, I am the first Prime Minister that has also discussed issues with a few people who work closely with me or with individual cabinet ministers. I mean, if anyone's telling me that prior to my arrival, the Prime Minister would wander into the cabinet and for the first time the subject would be opened up for discussion and no one had ever had a private discussion beforehand, I frankly don't believe it. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear if that were the case, but I don't think it is really correct. And I think that you can, I mean, it's true there is a sofa in my study, but that can't be a huge innovation either. There presumably were at least chairs or something for people to sit on, and not just a desk and a chair for the Prime Minister prior to my coming to office.
I'm sure Prime Minister Baroness Thatcher would have said the same thing if she'd been asked the same question. But isn't a consequence of sofa government? I'm continuing down this theme, is that special advisors like Lord Adonis and Lord Burt, in fact, are able to develop policies which don't have the support of individual departments. I'm talking about academies, for instance, top-up fees, I think, was another one, the move into nuclear power, all decided by unelected special advisors who are, if you like, ahead of the senior civil servants in policy making. Isn't that not been a danger of the time you've been in office?
Well,
or do you not recognise that?
I don't really. I mean, when I was a lawyer and you used to do the pleadings and you used to say, you used to deny the allegation, and then you used to say, if which is denied, the allegation has any validity in it, then you give your explanation. And I would say to you, one, I don't recognise the description of sofa government, but two, insofar as you do have discussions with smaller groups of advisors, I think that's perfectly natural. And actually, in relation to special advisors and politics, I mean, I want to say something that very clear, although it's not, I think, very popular in many quarters. I think the job of politicians is to have strong programme, to get elected on the programme, then to carry the programme through. And I think special advisors perform a very valuable role. And incidentally, we probably have a smaller number of specially appointed people who new governments bring in than virtually any political system in the world. I mean, we've got, 3,500 senior civil servants. We've got, I don't know how many special advisors, but it can't be more than a few score. And they do an excellent job. They're a vital part of the system. But the idea that a sort of special advisor comes forward with an idea and then the Prime Minister just introduces it. I mean, the Academy programme, for example, has gone through an immense amount of discussion and debate, and indeed adjustment over the years. The programmes for reform have very much been led by the departments themselves. On nuclear power, there have been I don't know how many different energy reviews over the years, and then there was a process of review and consultation again over the past couple of years as the situation on energy got more tight. And I think sometimes people just fail to distinguish between the policies that they disagree with and the process of coming to make those policy judgments.
I think, Prime Minister, there's clearly political debate which agrees or disagrees with a particular policy, and that's absolutely right and proper. But your government, one of the hallmarks has been to say that it's evidence-based policy, and it's a mantra that comes in for every single department. And yet on key areas of public policy, there appears to be very little evidence to actually support the policy direction. You can disagree, with that direction. That's fair comment. But the evidence behind, for instance, academies, the evidence behind nuclear power appears to be very, very small indeed.
Well, but I think that's a matter of dispute, with the greatest respect. I mean, for example, on nuclear power, nuclear power is hardly a sort of new idea. It's hardly the first time anyone's ever thought of nuclear power. We've had nuclear power stations in this country for over half a century. Nuclear power is used around the world. I mean, the one thing you're not short of is evidence about nuclear power, the industry, how it works. Now, it may be a good idea or it may be a bad idea. I happen to think it's a good idea for the reasons that I've given. But I don't think you could possibly say that those people who advocate nuclear power today have no evidence to back it up. I mean,
there's very little for academies. There's very little for academies.
Well, I don't agree with academies either. I think
you don't agree with them?
No, sorry, I don't agree with what you're saying on the evidence about academies. The reason why we have moved, and now have moved even further in the academy direction, is because of the experience that we've had, which is that if state schools are given greater independence and greater freedom, if they're allowed to develop very much their own purpose and ethos, it improves the standards. And we've been specialist schools, we're one step towards that. Then we've got trust schools, and we've got academies. I mean, I think, again, you can see plenty of evidence for it. And actually, the single best piece of evidence for academies are the numbers of parents trying to get into them. I mean, these academy schools were usually schools which had falling roles. They're now heavily oversubscribed. And I'm a great believer in trusting the judgment of parents in relation to schools. I think that if parents are trying to get into a school, it's not a complete indication of whether the school is good or not, but it's a fair enough indicator, I think. And my experience of the school situation is that the academy programme is popular now, and I think in time to come it will develop even further. But it will develop in a sense on the basis of the evidence. I mean, if the academy programme succeeds, it will develop even further. I mean, if it didn't, it wouldn't. But I think the evidence so far is very promising.
Unless we're careful, we're going to run into serious time problems. So could we have concise questions and some brief answers from Minister?
Yes, sure.
On issues that can be seen as populist, like asylum and immigration or counter-terrorism, do you think you're open to the criticism that rather than stand firm in the light of what professional advice or objective evidence may be, this is taking second place to the sort of the something must be done syndrome, and that's led to poor decision-making policies?
I mean, again, I don't really accept that, because I think in respect of asylum or immigration, there are real public concerns out there that you have to meet.
The public concerns, yes, but the evidence may point the other way. For example, on Section 4, the removal of support from fellow asylum seekers, that policy has been shown demonstrably to have failed, or Section 9 in relation to vouchers again. Do you ever get to this position where you think, well, we're in a hole, we better stop digging?
Well, I think the trouble is, you know, I'm not saying all the measures have worked, and one of the things you've got to get into the acceptance of, in a way, in government, I think this is quite important actually for policy making in the future, is to accept that when you try certain things, some of them will work and some of them won't. In the private sector, again, this is a very common, you know, people understand that completely as a culture. But you see, we had to bring the asylum claims down, and so we had to take those measures, and we have. And you know, the asylum issue is still a very potent issue out there, but 3 or 4 years ago, the numbers had risen, you know, vastly, and it was causing real difficulty. In respect of immigration, there are real fears and worries that we have to meet. Now, I'm not saying all the measures have succeeded, but I'm absolutely certain if we hadn't taken those measures, we'd have been subject to far greater criticism.
Yeah, I mean, the point I'm making, Prime Minister, is that, yes, you've got this something must be done coming from the public. The question is then, what do you do? And is it evidence-led, or is it simply a knee-jerk reaction to some of that? Is policy being made in a rush, effectively? In those two examples, neither have actually led to a reduction in immigration. In fact, probably the contrary, because people have just disappeared and gone missing into the woodwork, so you can't actually remove them.
Yes, but then I'd say if you looked at the measures taken as a whole, they actually have been effective. I mean, I'm not saying in every area they've worked as well as they should, but if you take them as a whole, they've worked, I think, far better than people ever anticipated, which is why we actually, for the first time ever, reached the tipping point last year.
Do you think that there have been decisions made on policy where the evidence has actually pointed in the other way, simply to satisfy the public? Or is it best ambiguous? And if so, do you regret any of those sort of decisions?
No, and I think that this is, if I was to be self-critical of the government, I don't think I'd be on this particular line of criticism. I think what is more difficult is whether the pace and the scale of change has happened fast enough in certain areas. My criticism is almost diametrically opposite from the criticism that is often made. Now, I've got all sorts of reasons and explanations for that, but I would say, for example, in the health service, but also I think in the law and order field and to an extent in education, it has only been in the last 2 years, 3 years, that we've really been pushing this forward with the vigour that I think is now absolutely necessary to do. Now, there are all sorts of explanations that we could probably never have got the consent for doing these reforms if we'd started them right at the very beginning. But nonetheless, I think that is the area where, as I leave office, I focus on most. I think this idea that we kind of just do a knee-jerk reaction to whatever the public, you know, headlines of the day is not correct, really. I mean, this is, you know, in each of these areas, in particular asylum and immigration, I mean, we were working on that from the very early years of government, often finding it extremely difficult, incidentally, to get legislation through the House of Commons because it was fiercely controversial.
Or maybe not based on evidence.
Well, except that now it has gone through. It's interesting how the next time we were thinking of legislation, people wanted us to go further rather than retreat from it.
But the point, I mean, some will work. Some, it's clear there's an issue. Some will work, some won't work. The question is when you start and put things right.
Yes, and I think that's a fair point. That as you go forward and as your policy evolves, then I think you can see some things that are working better than others. So, for example, if you take issues to do with social exclusion in schools, I mean, I would say that when we first set a target for reducing the exclusions, which we wanted to do for perfectly good reasons, we had to be careful that didn't send a signal that kids were to be kept in school, even if truthfully they would have been better off out of it. So you had to adjust the policy. And I think there's nothing wrong in saying that or admitting it. And I would have a further evolution of that policy today, which is, I think, often in the third sector or the voluntary sector, some of these things can be done better than through the traditional processes of the local education authority.
Very Chairman.
Prime Minister, can I ask you where you started off 10 years ago believing passionately in social mobility, and isn't it the case that some of the policies, particularly in education, where they might work very well, you know, putting the consumer first, you know, diversity of providers and all that, work very well in health, but when it comes to education, you must reflect on some of the research now showing that social mobility is actually, with all our spending on education, all the innovation, social mobility has slowed down.
I mean, sometimes how you measure this is a whole, you know, thesis all on its own. However, let me just go straight to this point. I think this one of the most important things over the last 10 years that we have done is to focus on early years learning. And I think in time to come, the Sure Start programme, the children's centres, the additional help on nursery education, these are things that will repay it themselves, not in the short term, but in the, or even often in the medium term, but in the long term. And I think they will make, I mean, I've seen for myself enough evidence in different parts of the country of where, you know, combining the early years services on one side, reaching out to families who otherwise would be left behind, has made a fundamental difference to many people's lives.
But in Sure Start, that was a classic case of evidence-based policy. Indeed, you followed it through when only a third of them were working very well. You switched across the board and learnt from the early experience. But when it came later on, if you look at the area of skills, here we have a tremendous problem with skills. Leach points out that there won't be any unskilled jobs practically by 2020. In the area of skills, you're actually forcing people to do level 2 qualifications, where a lot of other qualifications that give diversity and choice are being squeezed out of the system. So, there is another different area where you're not taking the same principles through.
Well, I think specifically on the level 2 point you make, I think there is an area there we need to look at very carefully. And I think that is a fair point. I mean, its purpose has been obviously to get more and more people with the level 2 qualifications, but I think it's a fair point to make. However, I would say that the changes we made in further education colleges, and you will know this better than me, and I've visited several just in the last few weeks, are producing real results and benefits in the types of skills that those further education colleges are giving their students. I would say, secondly, that, of course, the whole purpose of the academy programme is in some of the poorest parts of the country and with the poorest kids, to give them a greater opportunity in life. Since there's, people say, what is the single most important thing we can do for social mobility? The answer is education, in my view. That is the single most important thing. So I think we are improving the life chances for many, but, again, we need to adjust this. We've, I think, quadrupled the number of apprenticeships now, but we need to make sure they're of real quality. I think when we introduce the 14 to 19 changes, which will start in 2008 and build up over time, I think that will be revolutionary, actually, in terms of the way we handle vocational education in our schools.
But you mentioned the word revolutionary 2 or 3 times this morning. The one revolutionary thing that many of us wished you'd carried on with was the radical reform of qualifications from 14 to 19. And all of us, many people, certainly in the education sector, wonder why you did the research, you had the policy, and at the last minute you rejected the Tomlinson proposals. And this is a country where we have a genius for turning diversity into hierarchy. Aren't you now worried that what happened with Tomlinson? What happened with Tomlinson was the big missed opportunity. And why did you do it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, of course, we are doing what Tomlinson recommended on the vocational side. But I think to have merged the academic and the vocational in that way and had one diploma, I just think people would have been confused by that. And I think you'd have ended up getting into a huge debate about A-levels or dumbing down. And I just felt that it actually wasn't a sensible change to make. But that is often then taken as we dumped Tomlinson. We didn't. We accepted the vocational recommendations.
But we may now have a hierarchy where the brightest kids do A-levels, the less able do apprentices, and in between there's the new diploma.
Well, my answer to that is not to mess about with A-levels, it's to improve vocational education. And the one thing I think about these hierarchies, in inverted commas, is this. You can't, in the end, fool the kids, the parents, and the employers.
Yeah.
If the vocational education that the students are getting is of high quality, then that will establish its own answer to the hierarchy problem.
But Prime Minister, it was all on course. What pressures made you change your mind? I think you were at one stage very much for this radical reform. Something changed your mind. You had Adonis behind it, you had Schools Minister, David Miliband, you had those working parties. It was the most thoroughly researched piece of research ever. And you seemed to be for it right to the last minute, and then it was clear that you decided you couldn't go that far. Why?
I mean, it's not actually correct. I mean,
Okay.
when I was always very, very sceptical of the notion that it was a good idea to get rid of A-levels. I mean, what I was completely determined to do is to change vocational education. That is true, but I was very sceptical of it for the reasons that I've given. And as the debate went on, and this was a classic example actually of having a very intensive internal discussion in government, I became more convinced that it was problematic. And in the end, I mean, absolutely no disrespect to Professor Tomlinson, because he did an excellent job. I mean, I felt that it wasn't the right change. What was the right change, however, was to strip down and streamline, as we are doing, the vocational qualifications, to get them really sorted out, and to change the further education colleges as well, which are undergoing our process of change. And I think that's great, because they've been the Cinderella service of the education system for too long.
Now it's time for you to draw a breath, Prime Minister, or we move into the second theme, which is the consequences of constitutional change. Peter Love.
Prime Minister, I'm searching for the adjective. Let's call it remarkable, that speech you made about the media last week. In that speech, you lamented the declining importance attached to Parliament. You said you'd change nothing, and, quote, what has changed is the way Parliament is reported, or rather, not reported. Are you seriously asking us to believe it's all the fault of the media?
No. I'm simply saying that it's certainly not all the fault of anyone. But there is a relationship between the way Parliament is reported. It's no one's fault. That's not the point. The point is you don't get the same focus on parliamentary debates as you got when I first came into Parliament, and certainly 20 years before that. I mean, I just defy any. I mean, the chairman of your committee is in a better place to talk about this than any of us. But it's just the fact. It's not anyone's fault. It's the way the world works.
Well, perhaps it is someone's fault, Prime Minister. Writing in this week's Spectator, Charles Moore stressed the importance of the principle of le patron mange ici for any organisation. And let me put it here, you haven't manged, the proprietor eats here, for those who haven't the Prime Minister's skills in French. And let me put it to you, you haven't manged ici a great deal over your 10 years. The worst voting record of any Prime Minister since the war, spoken only 4 debates, apart from Queen's Speech debates, 3 of them in Iraq, evoked the Parliament Act on 3 of the 4 occasions it's been used, and 2 of them when you had a majority in the largest party in the Lords, halved the opportunity for topical questioning at Prime Minister's questioning time, flooded the Commons with 22% more legislation in the previous 10-year period, while modernisation meant members of Parliament didn't have the time to consider it, routinely timetabled bills, meaning the Commons Library couldn't even estimate for me the number of clauses that haven't been considered in the Commons, arbitrarily abolished the historic office of Lord Chancellor, encouraged your ministers to make statements to the Today programme rather than the House of Commons, and as your first and most symbolic act, moved the Whip's office out of number 12 Downing Street and moved Alistair Campbell in instead. Weren't you sending a pretty powerful message to the media?
What you mean, where the Whip's office is the sort of... I mean,
well,
Peter, I mean, honestly, I mean, by all means, it's a great list. But let me just respond to you directly and head on. The thing that matters about the patron manging ici is the number of times the patron turns up and answers questions. Right? If you go back over my period, I have actually spent longer answering questions in the House of Commons than either of my 2 predecessors in the same period of time. I've made more statements in the House of Commons, and yes, it's true as a result of the large majority, I have not turned up to vote in the same way, but it's not turning up to vote and going through the lobby that's holding me to account, it's questioning me, and that's what we're doing here, and I'm the only Prime Minister ever to have agreed to come along to this committee. So, I mean, by all means read it out, and as for the legislation, we have pre-legislative scrutiny, far more than we ever did before, and I think that will develop even further. The modernisation of the Houses of Parliament, with the greatest respect, is not a matter for me, it's been a matter for you guys. Now, whether you want to have it the old way or the new way is up to you or not, and I might have my own views on that as well. But the fact is, it is a myth, and that we have somehow said we're not bothering with Parliament anymore. It's just not correct. And the reason why I think it's important to sort of nail this down right now is that actually we do need to look at more innovative ways of having a proper public debate. That's why this forum, that's the reason I agreed to come along to this forum, because in the end, I think we probably get as much, if not more, out of this type of more informal dialogue when you can go into issues in detail over a period of time than you could really with the Prime Minister's question time, which, I mean, let's be absolutely clear. Of course, it's a major part of holding the Prime Minister to account. It's also a debating joust.
Well, Prime Minister, I anticipated you might say that about this committee. Now, look,
So you've got another list.
We're among friends here today, aren't we? And no one's really listening. So can you give us some tips? Because frankly, I don't think we got a great deal out of these sessions over the years. And I wonder why that is. Is that because you're too good for us, or are we doing it wrong? So can you give us some tips for your successor so we can actually make a more effective use this time when Gordon takes over?
I think it depends what you want out of this, and it also depends what you want out of holding the Prime Minister to account. Because there is politics as theatre and there's politics as discussion. Politics as theatre is what happens at the Prime Minister's question time. Now, as I say, I think it's absolutely a major part of our constitution, should be maintained, and all the rest of it, However, it is politics as theatre. Politics as discussion is what you do get out of this. Now, I've just had an interchange where I've actually, frankly, said what I think are the problems with the public service reforms that we did, or the rationale behind it. And the point that I'm making to you is, when you say, what have you got out of it, you ask in your own mind what you measure that as. Because I think this is the point that I was really trying to make, is that unless you get a whole lot of headlines tomorrow saying, Prime Minister flawed, rocking on his heels, didn't know what was going on, etc., that you will feel you haven't got anything out of it. But actually, maybe what you've got is a proper discussion of policy, which is, in fact, what politics should be about. And what we're all doing, and I've just said, because I'm off out of it next week, as you know, in relation to this job. All I say to you is that, in the end, most of us in politics come into politics because we're interested in ideas. And too little, in my view, of the present debate about politics is about ideas, is about things that are really happening to people in the real world, and too much of it just revolves around scandal, controversy, people bashing each other.
Well, let's get on with the policy, Prime Minister, but don't just say it. You're good at theatre, so let me just say parting is sweet sorrow. Practical Mike.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, ideas. You seem to have changed yours on the House of Lords. Why?
Really, I haven't.
Oh,
so
good.
Let me say that when I asked Jack Straw to have a look at this and see if we could find a way through, I said, look, if you can find a consensus, I will back that consensus. It's not
he
fair.
couldn't, could he?
And as it happened, he couldn't. True. So my actual view remains pretty much as it's always been.
So you favour a non-elected second chamber rather than a hybrid or an elected one?
I do, actually, yes.
And are you going to advise your successor that that way lies wisdom?
No, because I think he's perfectly capable of making his own mind up on the issue. And if people take a different view, which people do on this issue, that is entirely justifiable too. All I'd say, again, this is not advice to my successor, it's more my comment to my colleagues in the House of Commons. I would just say, be really cautious of trying to replicate the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I don't think that really works. I think if we want it to be a proper revising chamber, it's best to be a different type of chamber. And I understand the tremendous pressure there is, because if you ask people, should it be elected or non-elected, everyone will always say it should be elected. But I think your danger is, and I say this as someone who's had a lot of toing and froing with the House of Lords, as you know, over the years, but I do think we benefit from having people who've not necessarily spent their life in politics, who come in and can give a broader experience and so on. I personally think that's quite helpful.
Pity you wobbled then, isn't it?
Well, I didn't. It's not that I wobbled. I felt that if you could get a consensus on it, and I didn't think it was right for me to stand in the way of that, as it had been part of our manifesto programme. But you asked me my view, and I've given it to you honestly.
Now, Prime Minister, we have all these people of experience in the House of Lords, including the former cabinet ministers. Now, what's your intention? Are you going to do a Heath and stay in the Commons? Are you going to do a Stockton and go in the twilight of your years to the House of Lords? Are you going to do a Major and go and chair the MCC or something? What is your intention? What are you going to give to the country through Parliament after the 27th of June?
Well, I really don't know, but I'm very happy staying as I am for the moment, thank you. I mean, not as...
But you don't rule out going to the upper house.
Member of Parliament, I should say. I was about to answer all Peter's dreams of getting what he wanted out of a session of this, yes. Sorry. Carry on.
Prime Minister, can we turn to another part of the constitutional picture where your legacy is mixed, and that's devolution. Your manifesto in '97 said of your devolution proposals for Scotland, I quote, "The union will be strengthened and the threat of separatism removed." With a Scottish nationalist First Minister in Scotland, that hasn't happened, has it?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think the fact that the SNP beat us by 1 seat is obviously unfortunate for us as a Labour Party. But I think the interesting thing is that support for separation in Scotland is significantly down from where it was in 1997. And I think if we hadn't met the legitimate aspirations for people in Scotland and Wales for a greater measure of self-government, and in Northern Ireland too, we would have weakened the United Kingdom. But I think it's perfectly natural that from time to time people want to vote for different political parties. And if I could give you some advice, George, get your own party sorted out there, and then they'll offer us some competition rather than nationalists.
I think the threat of separatism... I think the threat of separatism hasn't been removed, which was the aspiration. But can I turn to a related question? The Scottish citizen, through his MSP, has total control over Scottish domestic policy. And through his MP, he has leverage, sometimes decisive, on English domestic policy. The English citizen has no leverage at all on Scottish domestic policy. Through his own MP, he has control over English policy, but that can be overturned as it has been. Now, how could that conceivably be a balanced, sustainable constitutional settlement?
Well, the alternative is the English votes for English MPs, and I just completely disagree with it for the reasons that were given 40 years ago when first debating devolution in Ulster. You go to two classes of MPs, it'll do a lot of damage.
But don't you risk then having two classes of citizens, and may that not be more important?
You see, I think the way that our constitution works is through a balance, and I don't pretend that you can state all this logically and define it in a way that satisfies everybody. But the fact of the matter is that the English are 80% of the votes, the MPs, and so on. If you end up in a situation where you end up with English votes for English MPs, you will create the two classes of MPs, and you'll do exactly the damage that people thought would be done all those years ago when devolution first was raised for Northern Ireland, and they rejected it then, both parties, and they were right to do it, in my view.
Can we look at the damage that may be being done at the moment? If you take higher education, we've just been talking about, a Lithuanian, a Pole, or a German pays nothing for his education in Scotland, whereas an English student does, and his parents are probably subsidising everybody else through their taxes. Now, how on earth can you defend that?
Well, in the end, what we do is we give a certain amount of grant, public money, to Scotland. They decide how they're going to spend it. We don't increase that, incidentally, as a result of the decisions taken by the SNP government there. If they decide they want to spend the money in a different way, they can spend the money in a different way. But then they're going to have to tell the Scottish people what other services they're going to reduce in order to pay for it. What they certainly can't do is increase the spending and then just hand us the bill.
Can we just talk about the money? Because there's a certain amount of headroom in Scotland which enables them to fund public services which are either not available or paid for in England, access to certain drugs. Now, Lord Barnett, he of the Barnett formula, last year denounced the Barnett formula as over-generous to Scotland. He said it should be scrapped and sums of money returned south of the border. Do you agree with him?
I don't, no, because again, I think it's part of the balance that we have in our constitution. And I think if we want to keep the UK together, the Barnett formula is a small price to pay for that, even though I understand why it causes concern in parts of England. And You know, I think that if you look at what has actually happened to the UK over the years, when you think of the amount, if you look around the world, the amount of secessionist pressures and separatist pressures there are and various disputes that there are within countries, I mean, I think we have found a way through that. And the interesting thing about the SNP is that I think if they did try to move towards actual separation, they would be brought up very sharp by the rest of the Scottish Parliament that is opposed to it.
But isn't your legacy to a Scottish Prime Minister a United Kingdom that is less united and people who feel less British? And isn't the going to be much tougher for him because of where he comes from?
I don't agree with that at all. And I think one of the reasons why we should be proud of actually what the UK is today is that if you go back to 97, I mean, let's not assume then that the UK was under no pressure from separation. It was under intense pressure in Scotland, to a certain extent in Wales, and of course Northern Ireland was how we know it was. I think if you look at the UK today, it is stronger. Now, of course, you'll get different governments from time to time, and I think that over time, incidentally, and I mean, I was only half joking when I was talking about the Conservative Party there, you will get a proper policy debate with a different policy agenda that will be more, more conventional in terms of parties fighting each other, whether in Scotland or in Wales. Indeed, I think you can see that happening in Wales. But I don't agree that the UK is weaker today. The fact is, as I say, if you look at what has happened in Wales, the Nationalist Party have had to eschew separation there, and if you look at the SNP in the recent campaign, they did everything they could to run away from the issue.
Promise, we must move on, I'm afraid, to keep to time.
Sorry.
Start.
Prime Minister, your original proposals to balance devolution in Scotland and Wales in England were to move to directly elected assemblies in England. That's not happened because of the no vote in the North East, and there is a perceived democratic deficit in regional government in England. Do you regret not being bolder at the start and just imposing a regional government, elected regional government system on England?
No, because I'm actually not sure that is the way forward. If I can again be completely frank about it. I mean, one big measure of devolution that we did do, of course, and people forget this when we talk about devolution of England, is that in London we have a mayor and an assembly. I mean, after all, that is the major,
Absolutely,
larger
but
city.
the rest of England, outside London, is left with nothing between, no elected, directly elected government between the national government and local councils.
Yeah, but I am more. I mean, this is again is somewhat controversial. I personally believe that we will eventually. I make this prediction in sort of 10 years' time. We will have elected mayors in most of our big cities, and I still believe, honestly, that is the way that we should go.
Okay,
I mean, I know that's not everyone's cup of tea at all, but I mean, I think, for example, when you've got a city like Birmingham, you actually, I mean, we should be going. We should also go back to the days politically, I think, where you could get major figures emerging in local government who would then go on to the national stage. And I think that has happened less in the past few years, but I think you can see how it could happen again. And I personally think that is, I'm not saying in every set of circumstances is where people want to be, but I think that's a better way to bridge it. And the problem we found in the North East, because we tried to do a regional assembly there, and if it was going to work anywhere, it was going to work in the North East, because of the coherence of the North East. But truthfully, we found when we got into the campaign and the referendum, the Teesside did not feel the necessary link with Tyneside, that County Durham did not necessarily want to be in the same place in terms of government as Newcastle, and even that Newcastle and Gateshead didn't. So,
Prime Minister, your keenness on elected mayors is an interesting congruence with the leader of the opposition party. But can I just take you to local government itself? Because although funding for local government has increased, so has control of local government by central government with the top-down performance regime and ring-fencing funds. Did the government get it wrong at the start? Because it now seems to be loosening up and freeing up local councils. And what would you recommend to your successor, that he should loosen up controls on local government still further?
Well, again, for my successor, that's up to him. He should be absolutely free to decide what he wants to do without advice from me. In relation to local government, however, I think what we did was we pushed through changes which were top down, but again, a bit like the rest of public services, I think if we hadn't done that in the early stages, it would have been very difficult. But we are now trying to develop a more nuanced way of partnership with local government, so that, for example, in some of these partnership area agreements that we're now putting together with local government, they could have a lot more power. And incidentally, this is one of the reasons why I do think this ties in with mayors and so on. I could see a situation where in years to come, if you had a powerful elected mayor in major cities, you could even, on some of the issues to do with benefits and unemployment and so on, have a situation where local government had greater power to influence those issues as well. And I just think that in the end, we needed to do this for the first few years, but I think we are right now to evolve to a more devolved system.
Thank you very much. Alan Beath.
In your early constitutional changes, you were working from an agenda which had been prepared beforehand with a lot of discussion, including cross-party discussion over devolution, constitutional convention, the Cook-McLennan discussions on a whole series of issues. And that, to me, is the best basis for making fundamental constitutional change. But when you came before us following the decision to create the Supreme Court and what was initially a decision to abolish the Lord Chancellor, you said that in retrospect we could have done it better. Had we published a paper, had we taken a step back. In other words, you'd moved from a very deliberative way of making constitutional change to sudden announcements, and the consequences hadn't been worked through. Isn't the first process a better one?
Well, it depends what it is you're trying to do. And I said what I said then about the Lord Chancellor's position. But just to emphasise, the reason why I was so concerned to get a change in the Lord Chancellor's department is that I always saw it as a major delivery department.
I'm talking about the method of making
I understand that, but it was a matter of urgency for me to get that done. But
well, was that the same with the Ministry of Justice? Because having admitted to us that maybe you didn't do the first one the right way, when the Ministry of Justice was created, the Lord Chief Justice read about it in the Sunday Telegraph, and the process was quite clearly a very unsatisfactory one for the senior judiciary. Why wasn't that the subject of some general discussion beforehand without the commitment being made before the discussion started?
Well, that was a different situation altogether. I mean, these proposals for changing the Home Office responsibility and moving to a Ministry of Justice were put to me within government late last year. They were then subject to a whole set of discussions within government, and it's a machinery of government change that I happen to think is right, although there is a perfectly valid alternative point of view. But what was necessary there was to make sure that we freed up the Home Office to focus more tightly on the security and terrorism issue, and also got the end-to-end case management within the criminal justice system. Now, I'm afraid I don't accept that it involves any constitutional change for the judiciary at all. The independence of the judiciary is now protected in statute. We will have a Judicial Appointments Commission that appoints the judges. That's actually a step forward. And I'm afraid, I understand the worries that they have over bargaining and financing, but that should be resolved in the normal way. So I don't really accept that was simply, tossed on people's desks like that.
So when you began this discussion within government, which doesn't seem to have involved very many people, not even the Lord Chancellor, why didn't you open it out at that stage, publish a paper, indicate this was the direction the government wanted to go, and get all the complications sorted out?
Well, there is, to be fair to what you're saying, there is a case for deciding you'll do machinery of government changes differently. But let's be clear, no government up to now has done that, has said if we're...
Well, you did it yourself in the early years of your...
Well, these were constitutional changes.
So is this.
No, but I don't accept the Minister of Justice is a constitutional change.
So you disagree with the Lord Chief Justice when he says we are now in a position where there is no agreement on the proper constitutional position, and in his words, that there is a serious constitutional problem.
I have an immense respect for the Lord Chief Justice, and he's doing a superb job. But I don't actually agree that we are changing his position constitutionally through putting the prisons and probation in with the courts.
So you are prepared to leave office and hand over to your successor, having made changes in the way the judiciary relates to the executive, changes which were embodied in the Concord Act that had to be produced to deal with the problems that emerged. You're prepared to leave office with the head of the judiciary believing that there is a serious constitutional problem and that you haven't understood it.
If I could have the constitutional problem identified, I'd be happy to look at it very carefully, but I don't think it is a constitutional problem. I think the real concern of the judiciary, and I entirely understand this, and if you read their paper carefully, it's very, very obvious. They want to know that there's someone in government that they can go to and make their case to, and they also want to know that they're not going to be at a disadvantage in relation to courts funding because the Ministry of Justice has got the prisons and probation in it too. I totally understand that. I don't actually think it's a constitutional point. However, let me just make one thing absolutely clear. In the early days when we were negotiating with the Liberal Democrats and others on constitutional change, I mean, I think it did work well. I mean, but those were major constitutional changes. There were things like proportional representation for the European Parliament. And I mean, truthfully, what happened, I think, Alan, is I think you would probably accept this, that when we came to the later stages of this, and in particular on the House of Lords, we couldn't really find agreement. So that was really the problem.
But I think you better have a meeting with the Lord Chief Justice before you go.
I think that's just a statement of the question, Prime Minister. Mr. Conti wants to look forwards at it, I think, rather than backwards.
Thank you very much. I like this idea of sort of having a chat, you know, instead of trying to score points. So pull up your sofa. I want to talk to you about the European Constitution. First, I want you to actually accept my thanks, because I think you've lifted the veil a little in the last week over the process that we've been trying to see through in my committee for the past 6 months of actually discussing what will be a treaty that will take Europe forward. And I have a couple of questions on that. What proposals from the Treaty for a Constitution for Europe, the previous constitutional treaty, would have to be in the treaty that you are presently negotiating for a referendum to be required before it is put to Parliament?
Well, I think the most important thing here is that, I mean, I never had the feelings about the constitutional treaty that other people had, because we'd actually negotiated a very good deal for the UK. But I accepted in the end that it was a treaty which, by its very nature and the way it was put forward, led people to say, well, this is something of such a fundamental nature that it should be put to the British people. Now, I didn't always accept that argument.
But that's what you said.
Exactly. Now, in my view, if people want an agreement this week, we've got to go back to a conventional amending treaty, because the whole reason why this arises is because Europe has enlarged from 15 to 27 countries. Britain wants that. Britain has argued for it. It's a huge achievement of Britain over the past few years that it's happened. Europe needs to work more effectively. What it does not need is a constitutional treaty, or a treaty with the characteristics of a constitution, to put it in the words that the Dutch have used. And in my view, we should be very clear about this, and it's important that gives me an opportunity today to make this absolutely clear, here and also to our European colleagues. First, we will not accept a treaty that allows the Charter of Fundamental Rights to change UK law in any way. Second, we will not agree to something that displaces the role of British foreign policy and our foreign minister. Thirdly, we will not agree to give up our ability to control our common law and judicial and police system. And fourthly, we will not agree to anything that moves to qualified majority voting, something that can have a big say in our own tax and benefit system. We must have the right in those circumstances to determine it by unanimity. Now, those are four major changes, obviously, in what was agreed before, and that is the position that we will set out. And if people want an agreement, I'm afraid we're going to have to agree on that.
If we achieved that and we didn't put it to a referendum, do you reject the UKIP assertion if we did not put even that treaty to a referendum, it would be an exercise in deceit, to quote their leader?
There are people who, if there is a comma from the constitutional treaty that goes into the new treaty, will say this is a fundamental matter and has got to be put to referendum. I mean, let's be clear about that. So, as I've said, if we hope to stop some people whose agenda, of course, is to change Britain's relationship fundamentally with Europe in a backward direction, if we're hoping to satisfy those people, we will never satisfy them. But if we achieve those 4 objectives, I defy people to say what it is that is supposed to be so fundamental that could require a referendum. And furthermore, let me just make this point. This is so important for Britain's relationship with Europe. You know, it is, I mean, I have been dealing with this issue over, obviously, the 10 years. It is fundamental, in my view, to this country that in the early 21st century, it is 2 alliances, one with America, the other within the European Union. It has to keep both strong. And over the last 10 years, Europe has moved immensely in our direction. And one of the things that is so important, therefore, is that we don't carry a mid-20th century view of the world into the early 21st century. And we end up separating ourselves apart from Europe at the very moment when, with a new French president, a new German chancellor, the new president of the Commission, we have people more on the British line of how Europe should develop than we've ever had.
So if you failed to deliver a treaty which all 27 EU governments would accept, which basically means the treaty fell, could your European participation be judged as a failure?
No, I mean, I think there's a lot more to it than what has gone on. Yeah. I mean, if you look in the last 10 years, when I first came in, we were completely isolated. We just had the beef war. Europe wasn't really moving in a British direction. If you look at it today on economic reform, on energy, on climate change, on European defence, Europe on enlargement, Europe has moved in our direction. And I think we need to keep our position strong at the centre of Europe.
Thank you. Now we move to the final theme, interventionism and foreign policy. Tony Blair.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister, you'll have noticed in all the assessments that are being made of your 10 years at the moment, there's one phrase that crops up all the time, and that is the phrase, "but for Iraq." You'll have seen Andrew Rawnsley in The Observer yesterday, I quote, "But for Iraq, he would be leaving Downing Street able to make an unambiguous claim to be one of the most successful world leaders of his time and one of the most successful British Prime Ministers of all time. But for Iraq, he would probably not be leaving number 10 at all." That's simply the case, isn't it?
No, I don't believe it's the case on the latter point. And as for the rest of it, it's a judgment people are going to have to make. But I believe that what we did in Iraq was right. And in the end, you know, you take a decision of that importance on the basis of what you believe to be right, and you stand or fall by it.
When people say, as you know they often do, that it was the worst foreign policy mistake since Suez, or some people say longer. Now, obviously, I don't want to get into your argument. You will say that is not the case. Would you at least allow for the fact that that might turn out to be the historical judgment?
Well, it's for others to make the historical judgment. I mean, I don't make the judgment of history. But you see, I think there is I mean, I'm just giving my view about this because I think you can see the same thing happening in Afghanistan if we're not careful. We're making a fundamental mistake. We think that we are creating this problem. We're not creating it. It is being created for us. The very forces that we are fighting in Iraq, which are basically Al-Qaeda doing the suicide bombing, including the bombing of that shrine, deliberately to provoke sectarian conflict, the elements of the Iranian regime who are backing the Muqtada al-Sadr people down in Basra, these are the elements that we are fighting in Afghanistan, that we're fighting everywhere. And if we don't stand up and fight them back, and at some point in time we're going to have to, they're going to get stronger. And what they now believe is that they can give us, and the politicians who are democratically elected in the West, such a serious problem in terms of the destruction and carnage that they are able to cause, that we will lose our will and fall away.
I think we understand your analysis because you've given it to us many times. I think the questions are about its effectiveness. You were sitting in front of us in July 2003, just after the war, and you said, and this is a direct quote from our session here, "The test will be, what does Iraq look like in a year's time?" We're 4 years on. We now know what Iraq looks like. Isn't it a tragedy that you happened to find yourself as British Prime Minister when the crazies were in the White House?
Again, it's immensely comforting to people to say, you know, if it weren't for George Bush, everything would be fine. September the 11th, you know, was planned before George Bush ever came to power. Any American president would have had to have dealt with it. And yes, you're absolutely right. I thought in July 2003 we'd removed a terrible dictator. We got in place a UN process for democracy. We were going to have an elected government. The important thing is to ask, what happened? Well, in August 2003, the first thing happened, which is that they murdered the UN Special Representative and his staff by blowing up the UN headquarters. Now, at that moment, we had a fundamental decision to take as an international community. Did we say, right, we are not going to let you succeed, or did we say, this is going to be really difficult?
But we're finding out more about this whole process now, and I mean, you'll tell us whether it's true or not, but yesterday's newspapers were telling us about the fears, worries that you had about the lack of preparation for what would happen after the invasion. We've got Sir David Manning, your foreign policy advisor, being quoted saying that you were terribly exercised about the lack of preparation in Washington. He was sending you memos about this. Jeremy Greenstock says you were tearing your hair out afterwards about the chaos that was ensuing. Peter Mandelson says that you came close to resigning. Wasn't it your burden that you carried us into a war knowing that there had been no effective preparation and that it was likely to be catastrophic?
Yeah. First of all, I wasn't concerned about lack of preparation. I was concerned to make sure we were properly prepared. Secondly, however, the issues that were exercising everybody in early 2003, and there was a lot of work done across government in order to deal with this, were issues to do with the humanitarian situation, to do with economic reconstruction and so on. The absolute key to this, and this is in the end why I will carry on making this argument, and I believe in the end that people will understand the importance of standing up for what we believe in. It is so comforting to people to say there was an error made in the planning. Someone didn't spot what was going to go on. And you can have this argument about departification, the disbandment of the army, and I'm happy to go through that with you. But in reality, even if you've taken different decisions on those things, that is not what has created the problem. What has created the problem is that the people we're fighting have decided to give us a problem. What they have decided is that if they can hang on long enough in Iraq or in Afghanistan or anywhere else, then we will lose the will. And that's their argument. That's what they're doing.
Was it the case, just to finish this, was it the case that you were warning about the lack of preparation? And
I wasn't warning about the lack of preparation, Tony. I was saying it was important that we were prepared. But the areas of preparation that people were most concerned about were actually to do with the fact that you were removing the government. 60% of the Iraqi population was on a food program. 60% of them. There were large areas of the country which didn't have proper power and fuel and so on. So there were a whole series of things like that were immensely important. Now, what actually happened subsequently, however, is that as we began to get the country on its feet, as they started to make preparations for democracy, then, of course, the people who were fighting suddenly realized, if you let these guys succeed here, how do we manage to get across our case? How do we manage to how can we say that the purpose of the West and America is to oppress the Muslim world if actually Muslims for the first time in Iraq and Afghanistan are getting the right to vote? It's a difficult argument to make.
Let me bring Edward Lee in.
What created the problem, and has at least given, you must accept this, a vicious twist to sectarianism, to influence of Iran, to extremism, to terrorism in the Muslim world, what's created the problem was your invasion of Iraq. I mean, Tony is right. You are arguably, and let me say this to Tory, you are arguably the most successful Labour Prime Minister we've ever had in the domestic front. But on your political tombstone will be written one word, Iraq. Do you deny that? And are you in a state of denial about it?
Edward, I'm in a position where I don't write what's on my tombstone, right? Other people do, okay? So I don't know what they'll do. What I do know is that if we end up saying that because these people are committing these acts of terrorism in Iraq or Afghanistan, that we shouldn't have done the removal of Saddam or the removal of the Taliban, then we're making a fundamental mistake about our own future, about security, about the values we should be defending in the world. And we cannot be in a situation where the harder they fight us, the less our will is to succeed. And if we're not careful, we will be in that situation.
No, we've had this, as you know, this conversation many times.
We have.
We know where we stand on that. But when you were taking these decisions that Tony was talking about, apparently you once told Roy Jenkins that you wish you had done history at university rather than law. I don't know if that's right. But when you took these decisions, did you have any sense of history? Did you go back to what has happened when, for instance, we were invading Afghanistan in the 19th century or Iraq in the 1920s? Did you go through this, what has happened in the past? Do you have any real concept or in your mind of, apart from the great vision thing, which you're brilliant at, and you once again you performed magnificently this morning, but on the history thing, perhaps you're a bit weak, are you?
I don't think it is a weakness of understanding of history, and yes, I do have some understanding of history, and I don't think that anybody in my position ever takes a decision to go to war lightly. But the situation we were faced in, for example, if you take Afghanistan, was a situation where September the 11th had come out of there. The place had been turned into a training camp for Al-Qaeda. So we either allowed that to carry on or we stopped it. And I believe that we had to stop it. And I also believe and this is where I take, if you like, a broader view, and whether it's based on history or not, you can judge as well as I can, that the real issue is that the roots of this are deep and pervasive right across the Muslim world, and we have to go back into the roots of it. That's why the Israel-Palestine issue...
Yeah, we have to go back in the roots of it. You've performed brilliantly in Northern Ireland. You realise the military solution doesn't work. You've gone into the roots of it. You've gone into the minds of Sinn Féin. Do you ever go into the mind of the Arab on the street corner, the Arab in Baghdad who's out of a job now, whose cousin has just been murdered in some sectarian killing, who's not interested in politics? Do you understand the massive hatred of us? And whatever you say, of course we're not the terrorists, we're not killing these people, we're not suicide bombers, we reject all that, you do. Mm-hmm. But don't you realise that you have given a massive impetus to our enemies by invading a sovereign country? I know you're not going to, of course you're not going to accept that, but is there no smidgen of doubt at the end of your 10 years? No, despite all that's been written, is there nothing in your mind that says perhaps I may have made a mistake?
You've always got to reassess and reconsider. Of course you do. But here's what I think the problem is. This is why I think that we will have difficulty defeating this terrorism and still until we stop buying a little way into its argument, or even quite a long way into its argument. I mean, I was stopped by someone the other day who said to me, look at all these people that are dying in Iraq. And I said to them, we're not killing them. What? How can we be said to be oppressing the ordinary Muslim on the street when, if the violence perpetrated incidentally by other Muslims on Muslims stopped, we would be able to get the country on its feet? It's a prosperous, wealthy country, and its people would prosper. And my point is this: I don't dispute that on the Arab street there is a lot of hatred of the West. My point is, you're not going to defeat that until you challenge it. It's the same as...
But you're a liberal interventionist. Don't you realise that your brand of liberal interventionism, your great ideas of peace and democracy and the values of the Western world, which we all accept around this table, are not necessarily the values of your opponents? Let me just put this last question. I think history is very important. And I was just sitting by my son's school yesterday. I saw a war memorial with 120 names from the Great War. And I thought, how can these people actually ever take us into war? How can they interfere in other countries in the way I think that you have done? In the dark watches of the night, is there never this regret? Do these thousands of people who've now died as a result of your decision, do they never come back to haunt you, or are you just completely filled with self-belief?
Well, it's as simple as that, is it? Of course, I accept a deep and profound responsibility for what has happened, and anybody who's ever sent people into action, particularly when our our troops are killed and doesn't feel the weight of that responsibility is not a human being, and I am a human being. But I also say to you that we had an example when we didn't intervene in Bosnia. 250,000 people died. In the end, we had to intervene. And when we intervene, and I've done it 4 times now, in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone, in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think the question that also has to be asked is, supposing in this modern world where we are linked together, we don't intervene. That's why I'd favoured intervening in Darfur now. If we don't end up in a situation where we take action, then look at Rwanda, where how many? 2-3 million people died. And the fact is, Edward, in the end, when we do intervene and we give people a proper democratic process, please don't believe this, that the ordinary Arab doesn't want democracy or freedom when we do. It's just rubbish. Of course they want it. Of course, what country has ever chosen not to be a democracy? It's just nonsense. It's what oppressive people do to justify their oppression. They say democracy and freedom are Western values. It's rubbish. They're the universal values of the human spirit, and they always will be. And the fact of the matter is, if these people in Iraq and Afghanistan, if they were allowed free from this terrorism, they'd be able to make improvements in their country.
Okay, on intervening, Mike Gapes.
Prime Minister, the basis philosophically of what you've just said goes back to your 1999 speech in Chicago, where you set out 5 conditions that should be considered before intervention. Can I just summarise them for you quickly? Are we sure of our case? Have we exhausted all diplomatic options? Are there military operations we can undertake? Are we prepared for the long term? And finally, do we have national interests involved? That case, you could say, worked with, you referred to Kosovo, you referred to Sierra Leone. But with hindsight, would you now accept that perhaps those 5 points were not undertaken when we went to Iraq? And also, would you, in the light of Iraq and in the light of 9/11, want to change those 5 conditions in any way?
I wouldn't want to change them. I think they're basically the right questions to ask. And of course, I would say that they are answered in respect of Iraq. I mean, I believe if Saddam and his 2 sons were still running Iraq, you just have a different set of problems. So, but you're right, that 1999 speech essentially set out my view that in today's world, because it's interdependent, we should be prepared to intervene.
But would you not accept that the difficulties that we all know, the very deep difficulties we now have in Iraq, has actually discredited and undermined for future interventions? You've talked about Darfur, and there could be others. It's actually the case for liberal interventionism is now much harder to make because of the problems that we are now experiencing in Iraq.
I think one of the odd things is that some of the people who are most opposed to Iraq are most in favour of Darfur. I mean, I don't think it actually has worked like that. But I think the one thing that we do need to recognise is that, and one of the conditions, I think, that I laid down is, are we prepared for the long haul? And I think that is the real issue, to be honest. I think, are we prepared for the long haul? That's the question I would pose.
But if we look around the world, there are very few countries, even in our European Union partners, who are actually prepared to take an interventionist position as we are. And, for example, there were great difficulties in getting numbers in the NATO forces in Afghanistan. The Germans have just had this interminable debate about aircraft deployments there. Isn't it the reality that your position is not now held by many other countries? And would your legacy be secure, do you believe? Do you believe that our foreign policy is going to continue to have this interventionist approach? Or in fact, are we now facing a situation where we are out of step more and more at the moment with most countries in the world, and even thinking across the Atlantic?
Well, I think, again, truthfully, Mike, that even when I made the speech, there weren't that many countries signed up to that doctrine, if you like. But I believe that perforce we will be pushed in this direction as a world. And I mean, I think you're right, there are varying degrees of enthusiasm. But what's interesting is that in respect of Afghanistan, there are none of the arguments that there were about Iraq. And yet even there, we've got to keep people up to the mark now, 5-6 years on. And I think that's an important lesson all in itself. And what I would say to you is that look, you can debate this, but the one thing I think it would be hard to refute is that over the past 10 years, for better or worse, and some people will say in certain circumstances it's for worse, we have been in the thick of it. We have been right at the centre of every major international policy debate. Now, I think that the other thing we haven't talked about today is the rise of China. And I think when you look at the world 10, 15, 20 years down the line, a country like Britain, this is why I'm not a Eurosceptic. It's got nothing to do with sort of, love of all things European, although I think European culture is great. It's to do with the fact that we are a country of 60 million people in a limited geographical space, in a world in which China has, even today, more people in it than the whole of the European Union and the United States of America put together and doubled. In those circumstances, economically and politically, their power in the years to come is going to be enormous. And the best way for us to exercise our influence is through our alliances and through a policy where we are prepared to stand up and intervene in certain circumstances. Now that's my view, and whether it's the view of people in time to come, I mean that's obviously that's their decision. But I think for us it is the only way we are going to make this country count in the modern world, and we should be grateful for the fact we've got armed forces that are prepared to intervene. Because if we retreat to a position where we haven't, well, we'll be in a different situation altogether.
Prime Minister, it seems to me, and you've done it again this morning, that you keep rewriting the reasons for your intervention. We went into Iraq apparently to move weapons of mass destruction, but subsequently claimed it was to remove a tyrant and impose democracy. And if I can ask you about Afghanistan, we went into Afghanistan having removed the Taliban for reconstruction and development, and John Reid told us hopefully that we would be out without a shot being fired. 60 of our servicemen have been killed, and the situation is deteriorating. Do you think it's right that we should be going after the Taliban in the way that we are doing?
First of all, just again to correct this business, what John said, I think, was that he would like to be able to say that not a shot would be fired. I think the whole purpose of his statement was actually warn that it was going to be dangerous. It is dangerous down in Helmand, and our forces, incidentally, are doing an amazing job down there. And it is difficult on reconstruction and development because, again, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are employing the same tactics. I mean, just recently there's the reports of them executing a girl for going to school. A few months back, they executed a teacher in front of his class for teaching girls.
But can I say, Prime Minister, I heard President Putin using those kind of arguments to justify the failure to prosecute human rights abuses in Chechnya. I'm not suggesting we have human rights abuses. The fact that the Taliban is wicked or that the people in Al-Qaeda are wicked does not detract from the fact that we have set ourselves objectives which we then change. And the point I'm suggesting to you is not the problem in Afghanistan now, that we are going after the Taliban and in the process, to quote the Red Cross, thousands of people have fled their homes and are continuing to move in search of safer areas. And specifically, indiscriminate methods of warfare, including attacks that, while aimed at military targets, can be expected to cause many civilian casualties, are carried out without taking precautions to spare civilians, and that's by international forces. How do you win the hearts and minds of the people that you're trying to provide development for if you are in the process making them homeless and indeed putting their lives at risk?
Yeah, but Malcolm, I mean, I think some of those reports refer to things that are happening in other parts of Afghanistan. Down in the Helmand province, we are doing excellent work on reconstruction and development. We're doing it with often the full consent of the local population. And, we're not failing in our objective. We're actually beating the Taliban down there. And it's important that we stand up and fight them. I mean, what are we going to do? Give up and walk away because they're doing these things of complete brutality. And incidentally, I think it would be very unfair if we started to compare what was happening in Chechnya with what was happening in Afghanistan. Although you're right in one sense that I always said President Putin should be supported in dealing with the terrorism that was coming out of Chechnya. But this extremism that's happening down in Helmand province, it's not the desire of ordinary people that this is the case.
Well, I can accept that, Prime Minister, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that you say on different occasions what the objectives are. When the circumstances change on the ground, then the justification changes, and that causes a weakness.
But it's not really quite correct, that. I mean, it's the objective was to remove the regime that was there, that was sheltering Al-Qaeda, and to put in place a democratic process, which we did. Now, they're fighting back, so we've got to carry on fighting.
Well, can I then perhaps put a final question to you? You also mentioned Palestine, which has exploded over the weekend. And can I ask what you would say to a Palestinian woman who said to me when my committee visited Palestine, you, that is the UK, invaded Iraq to impose democracy, yet refused to recognise the government of Palestine elected in internationally supervised free and fair elections? What would you say to that woman?
We have recognised the government. I mean, we've
recognised the government of Hamas.
We have recognised Hamas as having won the election. Let's be absolutely clear what the problem is. The problem is not whether we recognise that Hamas have a mandate and have won the election. Mm-hmm. The problem is that if they want money from us, and we are putting hundreds of millions of pounds from the European Union into the Palestinian territories, we need to make sure that that money is not being used for them to buy weapons. Now, they can get money from other people, I'm afraid, to go and do that, but they can't get it from us.
Final point, Prime Minister. The point at the end of the day, those were free and fair elections by the people of Palestine. Do you not understand that people who voted for that government and then found it undermined by the international community do not really believe that you're trying to bring democracy to them?
Malcolm, we didn't undermine. You see, this is why I say the propaganda of these people has got to be challenged. We didn't dispute the fact they'd won the election. We were perfectly happy to carry on giving the money to that government, provided that they eschewed terrorism and didn't end up in a situation where the money we gave them was then going to be used for terrorism. I mean, what else could we do? and therefore, to say that that amounts to a non-recognition of the government is just, I mean, it's nonsense.
They were the same party before and after the election.
Yes, but that's not the point. The point is not whether we recognise they've won the election. The point is when they then come to the international community and say, right, here's the giving plate, we want hundreds of millions of pounds, surely we're entitled to say, OK, we will give you that money and we will help your people, but only if you give up terrorism.
Could I, Prime Minister, just ask a couple of quick sort of personal questions at the end? One picks up what Edward asked you, which is this a bit about believing things too much. When we're all beating ourselves up over Iraq and not knowing what to do, what struck me was your absolute certainty about it. Now, I wasn't never sure whether that was just a front that you had to adopt or whether you really believed it. And then when we had the report on intelligence, it seemed to say that you believe things that you shouldn't really have believed. Now, you're often said to be a destiny politician, but does destiny sometimes get in the way of a critical examination of the facts? And do you really have doubt, ever have doubt? That's what I'm asking you.
Of course.
Do you?
How can you possibly not have doubt? I mean, look, in the end, in politics, you have to come to decisions and take positions, and you do so on the basis of belief. But I mean, the idea that you don't have doubt about it.
All right, you have doubt. Let me just ask this finally then.
Is this a revelation?
Let's ask it.
Give you a headline for tomorrow. He has doubt.
This is the last one. You're almost certainly one of the nicest people ever to have been Prime Minister of this country. And yet,
yeah. So what's coming now then?
Too late, Tony. You haven't heard the next bit yet. But your successor is going round saying that the job is to rebuild trust. How could this be? And is that code for Iraq, do you think?
Well, on the first point, I don't know whether that's a compliment or not in our business. But yeah, of course, trust is a major question. But you 10 years in, I've come to the conclusion, this is where I have definitely changed as a politician over the 13 years I've led the Labour Party, is I did have a tendency to want to be all things to all people, and that's a perfectly natural political desire, incidentally. And I gave up trying to please all of the people all of the time. My highest ambition now is to please some of the people some of the time. Even that has not always been successfully undertaken. And I think that these issues are just more complicated than it appears with a simple opinion poll. And I think in the end what the public does really want in its leaders is it wants people to take the decisions and to drive forward. And I think there is a bigger understanding amongst the public than we sometimes think as politicians, that these jobs are difficult, that the decisions aren't easy, and sometimes people are glad that someone else has taken the decision. So you've just got to be careful with this issue, because in the end, I think what people really do want, they look for leadership nowadays, and they want it. And incidentally, I'm sure they will get it from my successor.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, I'll be self-indulgent and allow myself one single question. Looking back over your 10 years as Prime Minister, what do you regard as a high point and what do you regard as a low point?
The low points are always when, for example, the Omagh bomb and the Northern Ireland process, sending our forces into battle when people die, when you realise you are dealing with life and death issues as a Prime Minister, and the high points are when you think that as a result of a decision that you've taken, sitting in Downing Street, something has happened to change people's lives. So, in fact, and I always say this to people, the thing that when I go around schools now, and I open a lot of new schools and a lot of new school buildings, I know it sounds very prosaic, but you do get a sense of a high, because you realise that was a decision that was taken in government to do something for people. So that's the way that it is. But it's whatever the high points or the low points, the one thing that is absolutely clear is that it's a tremendous privilege to do the job, and that's why you should never complain about it. I mean, I meant what I said in my resignation speech up in my constituency, which is that I do actually think that this is a great country, and I think the British people are extraordinary, and extraordinary people. And for anybody to come and be Prime Minister of this country is a complete honour, and that's the right way to look at it. So whatever the highs and lows as you go through it, that's the sentiment that you should leave with. And the judgments that people make, well, they will judgments they'll make now, the judgments they'll make in time.
Well, Prime Minister, as the House of Commons geriatric, I can say something without being presumed to be seeking something in return. This has been a new experience for you, a new experience for us. I have to tell you, I found it a fascinating experience over the 5 years. I think my colleagues sitting around the table will say whether they agree with you or disagree with you. They've enjoyed it and they found it worthwhile, and they think it created a precedent that we hope will continue. So may I personally wish you well, and wherever your future ambitions take you, may you enjoy yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Brilliant. I think that was brilliant. Did you get questions?